With the recent global rise of the People's Republic of China, the Chinese Communist Party has played up the country's century of humiliation from 1850 to 1950, which saw Chinese territory being invaded and colonized by European and foreign powers. The resulting Tianjin concessions were territorial reminders of Western and later Japanese dominance of China until the end of the century of humiliation. Although the reunification with mainland China of Hong Kong and Macau, which occurred in the late 1990s, long after the end of this painful 100 years, is more well known due to recency and the ongoing unrest, the foreign-built areas of Tianjin still have the visual impact on an ancient port city, even 75 years after their own reunification with China. Hello and welcome, I'm Alex. Just a couple of notes on where we are with the channel. I've posted the full source list for the Argentina video in the comments there. I hope you enjoyed today's mini feature on the Tianjin concessions, and another full-length feature is coming out later this week. Part 1 of a two-parter on a different era of European colonialism, Spanish Morocco and Spanish West Africa. I've also set up a Patreon for the channel, that's down in the comments, so please donate to support our Collapse of Austria-Hungary series. This will be a near daily series of short episodes taking place on the same day that events happened. So expect a few sporadic features in the months before the collapse until we, with the right funding, follow it every day from September 1918, starting in September of 2020. That doesn't happen without your support. I sincerely salute and thank you. Until recent decades, the city was known in English as Tientsin and had been founded in the 1400s, becoming a major port for nearby Peking, today's Beijing. By October 18, 1860, the Manchurian dynasty ruling China, the Great Qing, was greatly weakened and was in the midst of the most deadly civil war in human history, the Taiping Rebellion. China could hardly be considered an empire anymore, as it couldn't even reassert control over its own territory. It's been well documented that the Qing navy was severely lacking, leaving the ancient empire vulnerable to conquest and plunder by more modern imperial powers. The preeminent imperial power in the world at the time was Great Britain and Ireland, under Queen Victoria. The British colonial empire was entering its zenith, and the Royal Navy ruled the waves. The British had opened the initial crack in Qing resolve, defeating China in the First Opium War, acquiring trading rights and consulates in closed Chinese cities. Now, the Second Opium War was drawing to a close, with the British having brought France and America into the fold. With Russian support, the Allies crushed the armies of the Qing and occupied the capital and the Forbidden City. On October 24th, the four powers extracted yet more concessions at the Convention of Peking, where Christian religions of each country were recognized by China and extraterritorial trading rights were surrendered by the Qing. However, this treaty also set the precedent for Tientsin to be carved up into European colonies. The first concessions granted by the Qing and Tientsin were only to the occupying powers. Russia received the religious and trading rights but did not get any land at this time. America, meanwhile, had been officially neutral under President James Buchanan in the Second Opium War, but intervened on the side of the Allies. As such, it earned a small concession that was not officially granted in the treaty, as America was not a warring party. The American enclave occupied a small strip of land alongside the Peiho River, where they operated a consulate and a barracks. Adjacent to the Americans were the British, who had become the effective foreign masters of China in this war. They built magnificent business and finance centers to prove it. With a size just under a third of a square mile, the British had the largest foreign presence in Tientsin. The British were officially granted this territory in perpetuity at the Convention of Peking on October 24th, where the Treaty of Tientsin was signed. France, which domestically was an empire at this stage under Napoleon III, had intervened on the British side early in the Second Opium War, and as such it earned a concession along the Peiho as well. The French enclave included a great deal of extra riverfront. The riverfront along these international enclaves was controlled by a joint commission. British business interests and local affairs in the British enclave were managed by a British municipal council. Meanwhile, French administration was repeatedly altered with changes in the government back in France, which shifted to a republic in 1871 domestically, but still pursued its colonial empire as aggressively as Britain. The American enclave was not fully realized at first due to the American Civil War. Although it had a limited presence on behalf of the Union with British protection, the enclave was fully utilized after the victory of President Abraham Lincoln's forces in 1865 and was fully staffed later that year by new leader Andrew Johnson. The Americans mainly used their small area for military purposes. In 1880, the Americans ceded control of their enclave to the British and ceded their only colony ever in China. However, they maintained the right to use that small strip of land as much as they wished, and Britain now had the official rights to the territory, annexing it to British Tientsin. The Americans, however, would not give up on intervening in Chinese affairs. In 1898, as part of the fallout from the First Sino-Japanese War, which was won by the Japanese over Qing China, the Japanese were granted a concession in Tientsin alongside the French. This was greatly humiliating to China, not just because they had lost to their neighbor Japan, but also because China was now in the position of a developing country being colonized by foreign powers, whereas Japan was one of those advanced powers doing the colonizing. Indeed, Japan would be the only non-European related power to hold a possession in Tianjin. Still, there was no doubt at this point that the Japanese were advanced to the point of many Western powers. And of course, they were well on their way to their own extensive empire. Throughout 1898 and into 1899, Germany began negotiating for a concession with China. The Germans were responding to other European involvement in the area, and they had recently gotten involved with leasing or annexing several other Chinese properties. Early in 1899, Germany threw its economic and military weight around, as they did have a good relationship with the Chinese military, to secure a large German enclave in Tientsin. It was located right next to the British enclave and rivaled its size. On November 2nd, 1899, the Boxer Rebellion sprang up against the Qing government. The Chinese population was infuriated with the fact that the government had sold out to these Western powers. However, Empress Dowager Cixi took the opportunity to side with her own population against the West, declaring war on those powers who had initiated the unequal treaties, which included Japan. After Chinese forces besieged the international consulates in Peking in the early summer of 1900, a so-called eight-nation alliance was put together to invade China, rescue the citizens from the consulates, and crush the Qing. The Japanese, Germans, British, and French all participated, as did the Americans. They were joined in the alliance by three new official alliance members: Italy, Austria-Hungary, and Russia. This international force was led mainly by the British, who again were the master of foreign affairs in China. However, two other powers did not agree to work with the British, but still intervened in the conflict. First was the Netherlands, who took part in its own invasion of China alongside the eight-nation alliance. The Netherlands did not join the Allies because it was an officially neutral country by law. When the 9 attacking nations had the capital surrounded and the Qing forces were on the retreat, the Spanish joined in as well, sending their troops to help out in a similar fashion to the Netherlands. The Qing government and the Empress Dowager stood no chance in this 10-on-1 fight. An 11th nation, Belgium, provided significant economic and logistical support to the effort. The siege began on June 20th, and as fierce battles raged for over a month and a half, Europeans eventually succeeded in doing the rescuing, along with plenty of burning and pillaging in the capital. Japanese certainly not exempt from this. The 11 victorious powers were able to force yet more Qing concessions. The first concession by China after the war was given to the Russians. During the military intervention in the Boxer Rebellion, the Russian army had staked claim to the territory opposite the other enclaves in Tientsin. They began laying boundary markers even before the Chinese officially ceded them the concession on December 31st, 1900. Because of this, the Russian territory was almost as large, if not larger, than the British. The Russians claimed that's because their activity at Tientsin was growing. But in reality, they did very little trading at Tientsin. On June 7, 1902, Italy was granted a concession. The Italians received a relatively small enclave, albeit in the river bend for increased water access, next to the Russians. On the other side of the Russians were the Belgians, who had the most unique presence of all the foreign powers in Tientsin. The Belgians had not actually participated in the Boxer Rebellion, although China had declared war on them due to their economic support of the Allies. That being said, the Qing dynasty now wanted to cooperate with Belgium for business purposes. They granted Belgian companies an official monopoly on transportation in Tientsin for a period of 50 years. Thus, while the Belgians have the smallest architectural legacy in Tianjin, they have the most important legacy of all the foreign powers to occupy Tianjin. Belgian Tientsin was home to the Tientsin Company of Railways, which exercised Belgium's monopolistic rights to transportation and electricity in certain areas of the town, not just in the Belgian concession, but in the Chinese areas of the city and all the other foreign enclaves. This company, and the Belgians who worked and ran it, would in fact outlive the colony itself. On December 27, 1902, Austria-Hungary received its concession from China. This smallish concession included the corner of the waterfront at the intersection of the Peiho River and the Imperial Channel. With their concessions small and their business opportunities limited, the Austrians and Italians sought to exercise their maximum cultural influence on their enclave. The French had taken this exact same strategy to heart in Tientsin for years now, and the Germans weren't far behind in the building spree as well. This was certainly the golden age of the Tientsin concessions. Multitudes of large European-style buildings were constructed throughout the enclaves within the first 2 decades of the 20th century. This remains some of the most gorgeous and unique architecture in China today. In 1912, the Qing dynasty fell, replaced by a nascent republic, which, while weak, did maintain control over the Tientsin area for the next several years. That being said, it was powerless to do anything about the foreign possessions on its soil, and the territorial and economic debts of the Qing Empire were carried with it, including the foreign enclaves in Tientsin. However, World War I brought all the fun to a swift end. Surprisingly, the Tientsin situation remained intact for the first 3 years of the Great War. The warring powers did not use Tientsin as a base of operations for attacks against the other countries' enclaves. However, the situation changed on August 14, 1917, when the Republic of China declared war on the Central Powers. With most of the European troops away and no longer defending these enclaves, China occupied the German and Austrian enclaves on August 14th. As it turned out, Germany would lose the war and would lose all of her colonial possessions, and so the municipal Tianjin government relabeled this area as Special Zone Number 1. Austrian-Hungarian Tianjin, which had interestingly been the only colony Austria-Hungary ever possessed, was now ended as well. It was turned into Special Area Number 2 by the municipal government. Meanwhile, the Italians began lobbying the Chinese Republic to allow them to annex the former Austrian enclave to Italian Tientsin. The Chinese government refused this request, and Italy retained its small possession. Now, earlier in the year, the Russian monarchy had been replaced by a republic in the so-called February Revolution. Just like with France, the new republic took over one of Russia's very few overseas possessions. However, the status of Russian Tientsin was thrown up in the air that November, October on the Russian calendar, by the October Revolution, as the socialist rebels under Vladimir Lenin took over the Russian government in Petrograd, back in Europe. That being said, the Russian Republic did maintain control around the border regions of Russia, and as it initiated a civil war to win the country back, it maintained control for the moment over Russian Tientsin. However, the Republican government of Alexander Kerensky gave way early in the Civil War to more monarchist factions of the White Army, with the Whites essentially abandoning their concession in Tientsin. As the Civil War quickly turned in favor of the Reds, Lenin's Russian Soviet Republic held the final rights to the enclave. With a civil war in China now raging more intensely than the war in Russia, the Chinese central government took over the Soviet-Russian enclave, as the now near-victorious Soviet forces did not protest. 2 years later, Soviet Russia became the key state in the Soviet Union, and 2 years after that, in 1924, Lenin renounced any claims by the Soviet Union in China or Tientsin. Later that year, Lenin died and was replaced by Joseph Stalin, meaning that 1924 marked the end of one era of Russian imperialism and the beginning of another. Also in 1924, the last Qing emperor, Puyi, who had been allowed to remain in the Forbidden City by the warlords ruling China during this era, was exiled from the imperial palace by the invading army of Feng Yuzhang. While living in the Forbidden City, Puyi had been visited by Japanese ambassadors and came to have a good working relationship with them. The Japanese likewise saw Puyi as malleable to Japanese plans and vain enough to want his throne back at any price. Thus, when Puyi was advised by his English-speaking tutor to seek shelter with Japan, who had a more favorable attitude towards monarchy than even the British at that time, he stowed away in the Japanese embassy in Peking. As the population figured out where Puyi was, the Japanese embassy became pressured by the Chinese public to release him. Puyi was at this point hated as a corrupt symbol of the Qing, who more and more had come to be viewed as outsiders who had sold the country out. On February 23, 1925, Puyi was moved clandestinely to Tientsin, dressed in civilian robes and traveling on a public passenger train before arriving at the main Japanese enclave. While there, Puyi got several offers to restore him to the throne of China, the closest of which was by Zhang Zhulin, a warlord of this era who promised Puyi the throne back for a price, and later went on to capture Peking and take over. However, Puyi had turned him down, and Zhang set up a military regime instead. Puyi's concubine wife left him during his stay in Japanese Tientsin, and his empress consort expressed boredom and fell into opium addiction, as imperial life slowed and being part of Puyi's court became increasingly restrictive. In fall 1931, after the Japanese invaded Puyi's native Manchuria, the Qing emperor was offered the throne of his now independent homeland. However, with the Japanese army in full control, the regime Puyi was to lead was a nakedly puppet government, but the Japanese still thought him vain enough to accept the offer. The empress begged Puyi not to accept and said that it was treasonous to China to rule at the behest of Japan. On November 10, 1931, Japan staged a diversion to get Puyi out of Tientsin, paying 2,000 protesters to march towards the Japanese enclave and clash with Chinese police outside the borders. Meanwhile, the Japanese snuck Puyi down to the river and onto a small skiff. Puyi and 5 plain-clothed intelligence agents quietly boated to the Japanese military area further down the Peiho River, where Puyi was loaded onto his boat to Manchukuo. Through these 6 or 7 years, the Belgians had begun to grow their economic presence in the city, expanding their streetcar lines all over Tientsin, yet not doing much with their actual enclave in the city. As such, in 1931, the Belgian parliament approved the end of the Belgian enclave in Tientsin, reunifying it with a China now controlled by the Kuomintang of Chiang Kai-shek. Beginning in 1937, Tientsin was occupied by the Imperial Japanese Army. A puppet government had been set up to rule on Japan's behalf. However, the Japanese enclave and military base both remained under Tokyo's direct rule. Although the Japanese army had allowed the European colonies to continue for the moment, global conflict was approaching again, and in April 1939, Japan found itself at odds with Britain. On April 9th, the Japanese banker for the Chinese puppet government was assassinated by agents of independent China. Japan accused the British, who were supporting China in its war against Japan, of providing protection for the assassins in their enclave. After the British initially turned over the suspects under a no-torture agreement, they later discovered that the confessions had been obtained by the Japanese under torture of 2 of the suspects. Once this was made public, the British declined to extradite the 4 men back to puppet China, and the Japanese responded by setting up a military blockade of the British possession. They cut off its food supply and made any of the 1,500 British soldiers stationed there who wished to enter or exit subject themselves to a humiliating public strip search. The Japanese then erected an electrified barbed wire fence around the British. Remember, Britain and Japan were not even at war during this clash, although they were already clearly well on their way. Japan declared the blockade would not end until the British ended their economic support for independent China. Britain eventually signed an agreement on August 20th to hand over the suspects to the puppet Chinese authorities. The Japanese later arranged public beheadings for them. Britain and Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain took heat at home for selling out the four men, but Britain considered this to be more favorable an outcome than selling out Chiang Kai-shek's independent Chinese government. On that infamous date in history, December 7, 1941, Japan declared war on the Allies. At this point, of the other nations in Tientsin, this only included Great Britain. On December 7th, Japan occupied and took over the British enclave in Tientsin. Later in the war, the British signed away any future rights to the territory, ending the British presence which had had such a large part in opening China up in the first place. On September 10th, 1943, Italy switched sides in World War II. Immediately, the Japanese army responded by occupying Italian Tientsin. Along with the rest of the city of Tientsin, this was made a part of Wang Jingwei's Chinese puppet government under the Japanese. Meanwhile, the Japanese enclave in the city was still maintained by Japan directly. At the same time, the Japanese-controlled puppet authorities in the city arrested all the remaining Dutch transport workers and their families. The Japanese were brutal to the Europeans that they kicked out of the various areas of Tientsin, and this was a large reason why the Japanese were brutally evicted upon their defeat in the Second World War 2 years later. Although they had somehow stayed above the brutalities of the First World War, the Second World War had come to Tientsin with its full vengeance. With the Chinese nationalists of Chiang Kai-shek now back in control of the country, and the Chinese civil war against the communists now fully raging again, the Chinese nationalist state needed a boost from the Western powers in the attempt to fight communism. France was having its own problems with communist rebels in Indochina, plus there was a commitment in the post-World War II order to try to eliminate the practice of colonialism. This, combined with the fact that French Tientsin had only survived due to France's capitulation to Germany early in World War II, meant that France had very little leverage when it came to claiming Tientsin after the war. As such, it was historic in 1946 when French Tientsin was reunified with mainland China, the last foreign colony representing the century of humiliation in Tientsin. This was a pattern that, even after the communist takeover of mainland China, did not stop. As it turns out, the communists have been just as eager over the past 60 or 70 years for retribution for the century of humiliation. However, the relative freedoms granted to citizens in Macau and Hong Kong by Portugal and Britain respectively have led to a blurred line about who's actually benefiting from the reunification. That notwithstanding, the end of the enclaves in Tientsin and many other Chinese cities, along with China getting its first ever military victories against America in the Korean War a few years later, officially marked the end of the century of humiliation and the start of half a century of building towards superpower status. Whatever happens with China in the next few years, it's indisputable that the country's colonial past has never been more important to study from and learn from. So stay tuned to the channel later this week for part 1 of our Spanish Morocco video. Hit us up on Patreon so we can continue to develop the Austria-Hungary content that we're working towards. And of course, like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching Way Back History. I'm Alex. I'm out.